What if the biggest economic showdown of the 21st century isn't happening in summits, speeches, or even on the ocean, but inside balance sheets, reserve vaults, and code? While most people watch tariffs and headlines, a deeper strategy is taking shape. The United States is trying to fight a financial Cold War on three fronts at once. Trade policy to squeeze supply chains, digital assets to shape the next payment rails, and gold, quiet, ancient, and suddenly relevant again, as a potential backstop if the dollar's dominance gets challenged faster than anyone expected. This isn't a one policy story. It's a layered approach built for a world where money isn't just currency anymore. Money is infrastructure. It's payment networks. It's collateral. It's sanctions power. It's who gets to set the rules when crises hit. And since 2022, after the SWIFT cutoff and reserve freezes proved finance can be weaponized, every major power has been thinking the same thing. What's my escape route if I'm next? By the end of this video, you'll see how tariffs, crypto, and gold connect into one strategy, and why the outcome could reshape the global order. To understand why any of this matters, you have to start with what reserve currency status actually buys you. For roughly 8 decades, the dollar has been the default middle language of global trade and reserves. Countries that don't even like each other still settle contracts in dollars because it's liquid, widely accepted, and backed by the deepest government bond market on Earth. That creates a powerful loop. Global trade reinforces demand for dollars, and demand for dollars reinforces U.S. borrowing power. But reserve status isn't a trophy you keep forever. It's a reputation you maintain. And reputations crack when other countries feel trapped. Over the last decade, China's long game has been to reduce reliance on the dollar by expanding yuan settlement channels, building payment infrastructure, encouraging bilateral trade in local currencies, and increasing asset options outside the Western system. Whether you call it de-dollarization or de-risking, the direction is the same: more doors, fewer choke points. Then came the shock that accelerated everything. In February 2022, Russia was cut from major parts of SWIFT, an interbank messaging network used by thousands of institutions worldwide, while hundreds of billions in Russian reserves were frozen. The message to the rest of the world was louder than any speech. Access to the financial system is conditional. That single precedent didn't just punish Russia. It forced every finance ministry to ask an uncomfortable question. If a geopolitical dispute breaks out with Washington or Brussels, are my reserves untouchable, or are they a hostage? The answer determines what you hold, where you hold it, and which rails you build next. That's the backdrop. Not politics as theater, but monetary architecture under stress. And it's in that environment that a three-part U.S. approach, tariffs, digital assets, and gold, starts to look less like chaos and more like an attempt to stay ahead of the next system. The most visible weapon is trade. Tariffs are loud, simple, and immediate. They don't require rewriting the financial system. They require signing orders and enforcing borders. And politically, tariffs look like strength. Economically, they function like pressure, raising costs, forcing negotiations, and encouraging supply chains to move. In 2025, the tariff story escalated rapidly, with new rounds of broad and reciprocal tariffs framed as a major reset of U.S. trade relationships. The point wasn't only to make Chinese goods expensive. The deeper purpose was to make dependence expensive. If you can't reliably trade at predictable terms, you start planning for redundancy. Businesses don't wait for governments to calm down, they reroute. That's why you saw a familiar pattern accelerate. Companies shifted manufacturing capacity away from heavy China concentration, often not back to the US, but to alternative hubs like Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and Thailand. The tariff environment acts like a signal flare. The rules are changing, and they might keep changing. That uncertainty is itself a force. China, meanwhile, has leverage points of its own. It can retaliate selectively, target politically sensitive imports, and, most importantly, tighten controls on strategic materials that the modern economy needs, especially in electronics, defense supply chains, and high-end manufacturing. That turns trade into a chessboard rather than a boxing match, Each side is looking for the square that forces the other side to move. So yes, tariffs are partly about factories and jobs. But in the bigger strategy, tariffs are also a time-buying tool. They create near-term pressure while the U.S. works on the medium and long-term layers, controlling digital finance narratives and strengthening reserve backstops. Which brings us to the move that shocked a lot of traditional economists. In early 2025, the United States made a symbolic leap. It began treating Bitcoin not only as an asset class people speculate on, but as something closer to a strategic reserve category. In March 2025, President Trump signed an executive order establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve and a broader U.S. digital asset stockpile. The key detail is how it starts. The initial holdings come from assets already seized through criminal or civil forfeiture, rather than the government rushing into open market purchases. That framing matters because it reduces the immediate "why are taxpayers funding this" backlash, while still achieving the message: America is willing to hold decentralized digital scarcity as a national level asset. Why would that matter in competition with China? Because China's digital direction is different. China's approach has emphasized state-managed payment infrastructure and centralized digital currency systems designed for supervision, policy control, and integration into trade channels. The U.S., by contrast, can position itself as the sponsor of open, decentralized networks and private sector innovation, especially in places where people distrust state surveillance or have unstable local banking. At the narrative level, this becomes a contest of models. One model says, money should be programmable by the state. The other says, money should be portable, neutral, and harder to censor. That distinction isn't philosophical. It influences which system developing economies adopt when they're choosing rails for cross-border settlement, remittances, and dollar-linked digital tokens. And that's where stablecoins enter the story. If dollar-pegged stablecoins become a dominant medium of exchange internationally, they can extend dollar usage even where traditional banking is weak. Policymakers have argued that a regulated stablecoin ecosystem could reinforce dollar relevance by increasing demand for dollar assets that back those coins. So crypto here isn't a side quest. It's an attempt to make the dollar portable in the digital age, and to make US-aligned rails feel more attractive than a world where payment systems become tools of state control. But crypto is volatile, and volatility is not the same thing as a foundation. That's why gold, quietly, reappears as the third pillar. Gold is old, slow, and politically awkward. Yet, in an era where reserves can be frozen, gold has one advantage no digital ledger can replicate. It's an asset outside the reach of someone else's legal system. The U.S. holds the world's largest official gold reserves, stored primarily in secure facilities. The twist is accounting. The U.S. Treasury's official book value for gold is famously outdated compared with market prices, creating a wide gap between what the balance sheet says and what the market would say. That gap matters because it tempts policymakers with a question. If we recognized gold closer to market value, how much fiscal room would appear on paper? This is not a new concept historically. The U.S. has revalued gold before in different monetary contexts. The modern version would be less about returning to a gold standard and more about strengthening the perceived asset side of the national balance sheet during a period of debt anxiety and geopolitical stress. In February 2025, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent added fuel to this discussion by saying the administration intended to monetize the asset side of the U.S. balance sheet, language that immediately triggered debate about what assets could be involved and how. Even if officials later narrow what they mean, the strategic logic remains. If global demand for gold rises as countries diversify away from dollar vulnerability, the market price of gold rises. If gold rises, the U.S. sits on a larger, latent asset pool. That pool can function as psychological support for the dollar in a world that is less automatically willing to hold dollars. And the moment you see gold as psychological infrastructure, not just a metal, you understand why the gold narrative keeps coming back whenever reserve currency status feels less secure than it did a decade ago. Now step back and connect the triangle. Tariffs are the visible pressure move. Crypto is the digital infrastructure move. Gold is the confidence move. Tariffs attempt to reduce strategic dependence by forcing supply chains to diversify. That weakens China's leverage over manufacturing bottlenecks and critical inputs over time, even if it raises costs in the short term. Crypto attempts to keep the U.S. relevant in the next generation of settlement rails by making dollar-linked digital instruments and U.S.-friendly networks feel like the default. Gold attempts to provide an anchor if faith in paper claims erodes faster than policymakers can manage. The genius, if it works, is that these pieces can reinforce each other. Trade pressure accelerates realignment. Realignment increases global demand for neutral settlement options. Neutral settlement demand boosts the appeal of alternatives like stablecoins or non-dollar channels. Meanwhile, fear of reserve freezes boosts gold demand. Rising gold demand strengthens the U.S. position if it chooses to emphasize gold's role as a backstop. And Bitcoin, if it keeps gaining institutional legitimacy, becomes a second scarcity asset that the U.S. can hold without depending on anyone else's central bank. Think of the three-pronged approach as staged defense. First comes the fight over physical goods and supply chains. Then comes the contest over digital rails and settlement standards. Finally comes the contest over what counts as real collateral when trust breaks. This is also why people misread the story when they focus only on tariffs. Tariffs are the loud part, but not necessarily the most important. The deeper fight is over whether the next financial order is centered on US-aligned rails, China-aligned rails, or a fractured world where multiple systems coexist and no one has the kind of dominance the US had after World War II. And that brings us to China's counterplay, which is less dramatic but often more consistent. China's response to US pressure has tended to follow a pattern. Avoid full frontal collision when possible, build parallel systems steadily, and expand optionality for partners who want trade without political strings. Instead of copying US moves one for one, China invests in infrastructure, payment networks, currency settlement channels, swap lines, and trade agreements that normalize using the yuan. It pushes the idea that partners should be able to transact without routing everything through New York or Brussels. At the same time, it keeps strategic leverage in areas like industrial inputs, refining capacity, and critical supply chains. This matters because the next monetary era isn't decided only by ideology, it's decided by plumbing. The country that builds the easiest pipes, fast settlement, low fees, reliable liquidity, and political predictability, wins market share over time. If a system is convenient, businesses adopt it even if they don't love the country behind it. China also has a patience advantage. It can treat de-dollarization not as a revolution, but as an accumulation project. Each bilateral trade deal settled in yuan is a small step. Each new bank connected to China-centered rails is a small step. Each reserve manager adding marginal gold or non-dollar assets is a small step. The power is in repetition. Meanwhile, the U.S. approach, especially when driven by tariffs and sanction threats, can look more volatile to outsiders. Allies and neutral countries don't only ask who is strongest, they ask who is predictable. If predictability drops, hedging rises. So China doesn't need the dollar to collapse overnight. It needs a world where enough countries say, we want options. Because once optionality exists, dominance decays. That's why the U.S. is simultaneously trying to defend the dollar's primacy and build alternative reservoirs of influence, digital assets and gold. The real contest isn't just U.S. versus China. It's centralized control versus diversified options. And it's happening one decision at a time by central banks, corporations, and trade partners that mostly don't appear in political speeches. Every strategy has contradictions, and this one has several. Start with tariffs. Tariffs can encourage supply chain diversification, but they also raise costs and create uncertainty. Businesses hate uncertainty. When policy swings become frequent, companies invest less, delay expansion, and seek safer jurisdictions. Even if tariffs succeed as leverage, they can impose self-inflicted friction that reduces growth and worsens inflation pressures. Then there's the dollar contradiction. Policymakers often want a weaker dollar to help exporters and manufacturing competitiveness. But reserve currency status thrives on stability and trust. You can't easily run strong dollar credibility and weak dollar competitiveness at full strength at the same time. Pull one lever too hard and the other starts to wobble. Crypto adds another layer of risk. Treating Bitcoin like a strategic reserve signals confidence in decentralized scarcity, but Bitcoin remains volatile. If the government holds it long term, it's effectively tying national balance sheet optics to a market that can swing violently. That might be fine if the goal is a long horizon hedge, but politically it becomes explosive during downturns. Stablecoins are more practical, but create their own battles: regulation, enforcement, and systemic risk. That is exactly why Congress moved on the Genius Act framework in 2025, aiming to create clearer guardrails for dollar-pegged stablecoins. Whether that framework succeeds depends on implementation, global adoption, and whether other jurisdictions build competing standards. Gold revaluation is the most sensitive lever. If a government aggressively changes official gold valuation, markets might interpret it as creative accounting or fiscal stress. Even if it's technically just a recognition of market value, perception matters. Currency systems run on confidence. Confidence can evaporate faster than spreadsheets update. And hovering over all of it is the biggest irony. Aggressive financial weaponization can accelerate the very hedging it's trying to prevent. If countries believe access to dollar infrastructure can be cut for political reasons, they seek alternatives, even if those alternatives are inferior today. Optionality beats efficiency when fear is high. So where does this likely go? Not to a clean winner-take-all ending, but to a more fragmented system. In the short term, you should expect recurring cycles of escalation and negotiation. Tariffs rise, exemptions appear, partial deals happen, and uncertainty stays. Supply chains keep moving, not in one dramatic migration, but in incremental diversification. Companies spread production across multiple nodes because resilience beats optimization in a high-friction world. In the medium term, the digital money contest accelerates. Stablecoins, tokenized settlement, and alternative messaging rails compete with traditional banking systems. The US is trying to ensure that even if the world digitizes, it digitizes around dollar-linked instruments and US-friendly regulatory standards. The Genius Act's movement through Congress reflects that priority. Write rules that make dollar stablecoins feel safe enough to scale. Bitcoin's role is different. Bitcoin is less likely to become everyday transaction money at scale, but it can become a reserve-like scarcity asset held by institutions and, now, potentially held symbolically by governments. The March 2025 executive order created a new narrative lane: Bitcoin as a strategic asset category, not just a speculative trade. In the long term, gold remains the insurance layer that grows in importance when trust declines. Even if no formal gold standard returns, gold can regain influence as a neutral reserve asset in a multipolar system. If more countries diversify reserves into gold, gold prices can stay structurally supported, making U.S. gold holdings more strategically valuable as a confidence tool. The most realistic outcome is a multipolar monetary order. The dollar remains huge, but less exclusive. The yuan grows regionally and through trade corridors. Gold regains status as neutral collateral. Digital rails multiply. No single power gets the same easy leverage the U.S. enjoyed in the unipolar era. And that changes everything. Sanctions become less decisive, deficits become costlier, and alliances become more transactional. Now bring it back to the core question. Is Trump's three-pronged approach actually chess? It depends on what you think the goal is. If the goal is to restore the old world, where the dollar is unchallenged, trade is smooth, and financial leverage is near absolute, then the strategy may be fighting gravity. The post-2022 world is already building redundancy. You can slow that, but reversing it is harder. But if the goal is to manage decline into something more favorable, keeping the dollar central in digital form while holding scarcity assets that perform well in a fragmented system, then the strategy starts to make sense. Tariffs become a tool for repositioning supply chains. Crypto becomes a tool for owning the next settlement narrative. Gold becomes a tool for restoring confidence when the system is stressed. In other words, the strategy may be less about winning forever and more about ensuring the US remains one of the rule setters in a world where there will be multiple rule books. That framing also explains why these policies can look contradictory at the surface. You can't run a single straight-line playbook when the system itself is splitting into layers. You end up fighting on multiple fronts: trade, finance, technology, reserve assets, because your opponent is doing the same. And that's the real story viewers often miss. The US-China contest is not just about GDP or factories. It's about who designs the rails that money flows through and who holds the assets everyone trusts when crises hit. If the next era is multipolar, then strategic advantage comes from being the system people can plug into without fear. That's the battleground. Not speeches, but settlement. Not rhetoric, but reserves. So what should a regular person take away from a fight that sounds like it belongs in central bank boardrooms? First, these shifts hit your life through prices. Tariffs change import costs. Supply chain restructuring changes what's available, how quickly, and at what price. Currency transitions change inflation dynamics because reserve demand affects borrowing costs and how easily governments can finance deficits. Second, these shifts hit your life through stability. A world with one dominant monetary center tends to have predictable rails, even if it's unequal. A world with multiple competing rails can be more resilient in some ways, but it can also be more chaotic. Fragmented standards, competing regulations, more frequent disruptions when geopolitics flares. Third, these shifts hit your life through control. Digital currency systems aren't neutral. Some are built for privacy and open access. Others are built for supervision and enforcement. As money goes digital, the debate over freedom versus control moves from philosophy into software. That's why the three-pronged approach matters beyond politics. Tariffs are about leverage today. Crypto policy is about what money looks like tomorrow. Gold strategy is about what people trust when tomorrow gets messy. And this is happening in real time, not in textbooks. The 2022 precedent accelerated hedging behavior globally. The 2025 moves, tariffs and digital asset policy, reflect an attempt to respond to that acceleration. Whether the end state arrives in 10 years or 20, the direction is clear. We're moving away from a single financial operating system and toward a world of competing systems. The winners won't just be the countries with the biggest militaries. They'll be the ones whose rails are easiest to use, whose assets are hardest to weaponize, and whose credibility survives the next crisis. If you only remember one thing from this breakdown, let it be this. The most important battles today aren't always visible. They're fought in trade routes, reserve vaults, and payment networks, because whoever controls those controls the options everyone else has. Tariffs are the headline weapon. Crypto policy is the infrastructure bet. Gold is the long-term backstop. Together, they form a strategy designed for a world where the dollar's dominance isn't guaranteed, and where China is building parallel systems fast enough to matter. So the real question isn't, do you like Trump or do you like China? The real question is, which financial architecture is the world moving toward? One centered on open networks and dollar-linked rails, or one centered on state-controlled rails and alternative reserve anchors? If you want more deep, pattern-based breakdowns of power, finance, and systems, subscribe and stay with the series. And drop a comment. Is this three-pronged strategy a smart adaptation to a multipolar era, or is it accelerating the shift it's trying to slow?